A scuba diver cleaning up Fallen Leaf Lake near Lake Tahoe ended up finding more than just trash. He brought it to the Lake Tahoe Historical Museum for answers. Their research found it could be a landmine.
Lake Tahoe is often described as one of the clearest lakes on Earth, so clear that sunlight can penetrate dozens of feet into its surface. But that image only tells part of the story.
There's things in this lake that nobody's ever seen.
There's a high probability that there's definitely something in the bottom.
People have been seeing weird stuff in the lake for a very long period of time.
There's a lot of things in this world we don't know about.
In 2024, an extreme shift from record snow to severe drought pulled the lake back, exposing shoreline areas unseen for decades. What looked like a temporary environmental setback quickly became something more unsettling. As water levels dropped, researchers deployed remote underwater cameras into the deep basin down to 1,600 feet, where darkness is complete, and temperatures hover near freezing. What they recorded was not just routine scientific data. This is the story of what's actually at the bottom of Lake Tahoe, and why the billions of dollars being spent to save it might be fixing the wrong problem entirely. By the end of this video, you will never look at Lake Tahoe the same way again. What Lake Tahoe really is beneath the surface. Lake Tahoe does not look like an ordinary mountain lake at first glance. From the surface, it appears calm, blue, and almost harmless, like a giant bowl of glass sitting between tall mountains. But underneath that peaceful surface sits one of the most extreme natural environments in North America, shaped by forces that go far deeper than what the eye can see. The lake rests high up in the Sierra Nevada mountain range at more than 6,000 feet above sea level. That alone makes it unusual. Most large lakes sit in lowlands where rivers and rain naturally collect. This one sits in the sky, surrounded by rocky peaks that trap it in a high-altitude basin. The size is massive, stretching over 20 miles in length and more than 10 miles across. But what matters most is not what can be seen from above. What matters is what lies below. At its deepest point, the lake drops to around 1,600 feet. That depth is difficult to picture without comparison. If several tall skyscrapers were stacked one on top of another and placed into the water, the top would still not reach the surface. The lake floor feels less like a gentle slope and more like a sudden fall, as if the ground simply gave up and collapsed into darkness. This shape is not accidental. The basin was formed by tectonic activity, where the Earth's crust pulled apart and shifted over millions of years. Instead of being slowly carved by ice or river flow, the ground fractured under pressure. One side rose while the other dropped, creating steep underwater walls that plunge almost straight down. The result is a natural container that holds an enormous volume of water and isolates anything that sinks deep enough. The water itself holds an almost famous level of clarity. Sunlight travels farther here than in most lakes because there are very few particles floating inside it. The surrounding granite rock does not release many nutrients, which means fewer algae and less biological growth. Cold temperatures slow everything down even more. Even in summer, the deeper layers remain close to freezing. This creates water so clear that objects remain visible far below the surface, giving the lake its signature bright blue appearance. But clarity has a hidden consequence. What can be seen from above represents only the upper layer. Below a certain depth, the environment changes completely. Around 1,500 feet down, the lake stops behaving like a single connected body of water. It separates into layers. The upper layer mixes with wind and seasonal temperature shifts. The deep layer does not. It stays still, cold, and sealed off from the world above. This separation creates something like a natural vault. Once material sinks below the mixing zone, it enters a space where change slows dramatically. There is no sunlight. There is almost no oxygen movement. Temperatures remain near constant year-round. Organic material that would normally decay quickly in rivers or shallow lakes can remain preserved for decades. Even gases that might normally cause movement or buoyancy remain trapped under pressure. The deeper environment behaves almost like a locked room. Nothing easily rises, nothing easily falls further in any meaningful way, and almost nothing interacts with the surface again. The lake effectively creates two different worlds stacked on top of each other. One alive, active, and visible. The other silent, dark, and nearly motionless. This is why the lake has long attracted attention far beyond tourism. On the surface, millions of visitors arrive every year to see the clear blue water and mountain scenery. Beneath that beauty, however, lies a system that is unusually stable and difficult to monitor. Objects that disappear below the upper layers do not reappear quickly. In many cases, they do not reappear at all within human timescales. The boom that buried the evidence. After World War II, the quiet mountain environment around Lake Tahoe began to shift in a way that changed everything without immediately showing its consequences. Before that moment in history, the area remained difficult to reach. Roads were rough, winters were severe, and only a small number of visitors ever made the journey. The lake existed more as a remote natural feature than a developed destination. That balance did not last long after the war ended. Military activity across the Sierra Nevada had already introduced improved infrastructure into the region. Roads were expanded and strengthened to support movement through the mountains. Once those routes existed, access stopped being the main barrier. Movement into the basin became faster, easier, and more frequent. With easier access came rapid economic interest. The Nevada side of the lake, where gambling laws created different opportunities for business, became a focal point for expansion. Large construction projects began to appear in clusters. Casinos rose quickly. Hotels followed soon after. Entertainment facilities, service buildings, and housing developments began filling spaces that had previously remained undeveloped for decades. This expansion did not happen slowly. Growth occurred in bursts, driven by demand and opportunity rather than long-term planning. Entire stretches of shoreline changed character within a relatively short time. Seasonal cabins transformed into permanent residences. Dirt roads turned into paved highways capable of handling year-round traffic. Alongside this growth came a much less visible development, the production of waste on a large and continuous scale. Every new building required materials, and every completed structure required maintenance. Hotels operated constantly, producing laundry waste and wastewater. Restaurants and casinos functioned day and night, increasing the load on local systems. Construction sites generated leftover materials, broken equipment, and unused industrial supplies. During this period, environmental regulation remained in an early stage of development. Waste management systems existed, but enforcement was limited and inconsistent. Classification of hazardous materials was still developing, and many substances now considered dangerous were not yet fully understood in that way. Disposal decisions were often based on cost, speed, and convenience rather than long-term environmental impact. Geography played an important role in shaping those decisions. The lake's size and accessibility made it a convenient option compared to transporting waste over long distances through mountain terrain. Moving materials across steep roads and unpredictable weather conditions required significant effort and expense. In contrast, shoreline access points made disposal into the water relatively easy in comparison. As a result, waste from multiple sources entered the lake system during the height of development. Construction debris, industrial byproducts, and mechanical waste accumulated over time. Some materials settled quickly into deeper areas. Others remained near the surface before gradually sinking. From above, the surface of the lake continued to appear stable, clear, and unchanged, masking the activity occurring below. The structure of the lake itself contributed to what happened next. Deep waters remained cold and separated from surface circulation. Layers within the water column reduced mixing between the upper and lower zones. Once materials reached deeper regions, movement became extremely limited. Low temperatures slowed chemical reactions, and a lack of light reduced biological activity. Conditions in the deeper basin created a stable environment where change occurred at an extremely slow rate. As environmental awareness increased in the 1960s and 1970s, attention shifted toward protecting visible water quality. Monitoring programs were introduced. Scientific stations began tracking surface conditions. Regulations became stricter, and direct dumping practices were eventually reduced and controlled. From the surface, improvements became visible over time, reinforcing the belief that earlier impacts had been resolved or neutralized. What the water level exposed. By 2024, something had been building quietly for years around Lake Tahoe. Winters had been coming with less snow. Storms were weaker and less frequent. The mountain snowpack, the frozen reserve that slowly feeds rivers and streams, kept shrinking. And when that happens, everything downstream begins to feel it. Lake Tahoe depends heavily on that snowpack. When snow melts, it flows into the lake through streams and rivers, keeping water levels steady. But in 2024, that system broke the balance. There was less water coming in than leaving. Evaporation, driven by the sun and wind, started to win. Over time, the lake level dropped about 9 feet from where it normally sits. Now, 9 feet might not sound like much for a lake that is over 1,000 feet deep. But that drop did not happen at the bottom. It happened at the edges, and that is where things started to change. As the water slowly pulled back from the shoreline, areas that had been hidden for decades began to reappear. Ground that had been underwater since the mid-20th century was suddenly exposed to air again. What came into view did not look like a natural landscape. The first signs were small. Hikers walking along the newly exposed shore began noticing strange objects. Old tires half buried in sand, rusted metal pieces sticking out at odd angles, glass bottles from brands that no longer exist. Some objects looked so old that it was hard to guess when they had been left there. At first, it seemed like ordinary litter, just the kind of trash that builds up over time when people are careless. But then the pattern became harder to ignore. Some of the objects were not random at all. They appeared in clusters. Certain areas had more debris than others, especially near spots where roads once came close to the water or where cliffs dropped sharply into the lake. It started to look less like scattered litter and more like something that had been deliberately placed there long ago. Then the divers entered the picture. Cleanup teams had already been working in the lake, removing modern waste and monitoring water quality. With the water level lower than usual, some parts of the lake that were once too deep for standard diving suddenly became reachable. Areas that used to require special equipment could now be explored with simpler gear. That is when the cars were found. Not just one or two, dozens. Vehicles from different decades sat on the lake bed, resting quietly as if they had been parked there and forgotten. Some were from the 1940s, others from the 1950s and 1960s. They were not all in one place either. They were spread out, often near old access points, places where a vehicle could have been pushed or rolled into the water. What made the discovery even stranger was the condition of the cars. In most lakes, submerged vehicles quickly break down. Water, heat, and bacteria cause metal to rust and interiors to collapse. But here, in the cold depths of Lake Tahoe, the process had slowed almost to a stop. Paint still clung to the surfaces of some vehicles. Shapes were clear. Doors, seats, and even small interior details remained visible. It looked less like wreckage and more like a paused moment in time. One dive could feel like stepping into a frozen past, where nothing had fully moved on. But even that was not the most unsettling part. As divers began documenting their findings, something underneath the vehicles became visible. Layers. Not just one layer of debris, but multiple. It looked like a history written in objects, stacked over time. Beneath the cars were other materials, older, less recognizable, sometimes buried partially in sediment. Researchers became interested quickly. Data from these dives were shared with scientific teams, including those studying the lake's long-term environmental patterns. To go further, technology was needed. Human divers can only reach so deep safely. Beyond that, machines take over. Remotely operated vehicles, small robotic systems with cameras and lights, were sent down into deeper parts of the lake. These machines could travel hundreds of feet below the surface, into areas where sunlight no longer reaches. At depths between 200 and 500 feet, the cameras began to reveal more of the same pattern. More vehicles, more debris. More signs that this was not a series of random accidents, but something repeated over time. The lake bed in those areas looked like a record of decades of disposal, stretching across space like a timeline that no one had been reading. And then came the decision to go even deeper. Because everything found so far had been within reach of earlier exploration limits. The deeper zones, the ones below human diving range, where the lake becomes completely dark and still, had barely been seen. That was where the real unknown began. What the camera found. The descent into the depths of Lake Tahoe did not feel like a normal exploration. It felt more like entering a place that had been sealed off for decades. As the remotely operated vehicle moved past 1,000 feet, the last traces of sunlight disappeared completely. From that point on, only the machine's lights could reveal anything. The water stayed cold, almost frozen in time, and the silence down there felt absolute. At that depth, nothing behaves the way it does near the surface. The temperature stays just above freezing all year round, never changing. The pressure becomes intense enough to crush anything unprotected in seconds. It is not just deep, it is a completely different world. One where time slows down and anything that reaches the bottom stays there, untouched and unseen. At first, the cameras showed something expected. More debris was scattered across the lake bed, like pieces of a story that had been forgotten. Old metal objects, broken shapes, and things that clearly did not belong in a natural setting. It followed the same pattern already seen in shallower areas, just darker and harder to understand. Nothing about it felt random, but it was still familiar. Then, something changed. Around 1,400 feet, the lights hit something unusual. Large shapes appeared in the distance, not random, but repeated over and over again. Cylinders. At first, just one or two came into view, but as the camera moved slightly, more appeared. Then, even more. It quickly became clear that this was not a small discovery. This was something much bigger. Barrels covered the lake floor. Industrial drums, the kind used to store chemicals, stretched across the sediment. Some were grouped together like they had been dropped in batches. Others were scattered, lying on their sides or standing upright. The arrangement did not look natural at all. It looked planned, deliberate, like something done over time, not all at once. Even after decades underwater, many of the barrels had not completely broken apart. The cold had slowed everything down. Instead of falling apart quickly, the metal had aged slowly, preserving details that should have disappeared long ago. Some still had markings, faint labels, symbols, and letters from another time. That is when the realization started to settle in. Barrels like these do not end up at that depth by accident. They are too heavy and too specific. They had to be brought there. That means someone transported them to the lake, moved them to the edge, and pushed them in. And not just once. The number of barrels made was clear. This had happened again and again. The camera kept moving, and the barrels kept appearing. It was not just a handful. It was hundreds, spread across the lake bed as far as the light could reach. The pattern suggested repeated dumping over the years. Some barrels had fallen straight down and stayed exactly where they landed. Others had drifted slightly before settling, spreading across the bottom in a wide, uneven field. Then, the camera went deeper. At around 1,600 feet, near the limit of what the machine could handle, another group of barrels came into view. These were different, larger, stronger, built to hold something more serious. The metal looked thicker, the shape more reinforced. These were not ordinary containers. And then came the detail that changed everything. These barrels were not just sitting there, they were leaking. What's in the water? The cameras stayed locked on the same spot deep beneath Lake Tahoe, and at first, nothing seemed to move. Then, slowly, something became visible. From a cracked section of one of the barrels, a thin cloud drifted out. It did not rush or spread quickly. It moved gently, almost like smoke in still air, floating in water that had not been disturbed in decades. Down at 1,600 feet, the environment is so calm that even the smallest movement stands out. There are no waves, no strong currents, nothing to mix things around quickly. So when material leaks from a container, it does not disappear right away. It hangs there, forming a faint cloudy plume that slowly stretches and spreads over time. That detail changed everything. It meant the barrels were not just old objects sitting on the lake bed. They were still active in a way. Whatever had been sealed inside them years ago was no longer fully contained. Little by little, it was escaping into the surrounding water, staying visible for longer than it would anywhere closer to the surface. The research team did not rely on the footage alone. Samples had to be collected. The ROV carefully moved as close as it could to the leaking barrels and captured small amounts of water from the area. Those samples were sealed immediately and brought back to the surface for testing. Within days, the results came back, and the water was not clean. It contained heavy metals, substances that are dangerous even in small amounts. Lead showed up at levels far above what is considered safe. Mercury was present. So were cadmium and arsenic. Alongside these were chemical solvents, the kind once used in industrial work but now banned or tightly controlled because of how harmful they are. These were not tiny traces that could be explained by natural processes. The levels were too high, too concentrated. This was not something that came from rocks or the atmosphere. It matched the kind of waste produced by industrial activity: metalwork, car repairs, dry cleaning, chemical processing, and other operations that were common during the rapid growth around the lake decades earlier. At some point in the past, waste like this had been collected, stored in barrels, and then brought to the lake. Instead of being treated or safely disposed of, it had been dumped into the water. Not once, but many times. Enough times to leave hundreds of containers spread across the bottom. The decision behind that action likely seemed simple at the time. Proper disposal would have been expensive. Transporting waste across mountains would have taken effort. But the lake was right there, deep, cold, and out of sight. It must have felt like a perfect solution, a place where nothing would come back. For a long time, it looked like that assumption was correct. The surface of the lake stayed clear. Tourists continued to visit, drawn by the bright blue water and the surrounding mountains. Scientists monitored the upper layers and saw little change. Everything suggested that the lake remained one of the cleanest in the country. But the deep water told a different story. The samples showed that contamination had not stayed completely trapped. It had been spreading slowly over time, not in a dramatic way, not something that would cause sudden alarm, but in a gradual, steady process. Tiny amounts of these substances had begun appearing at depths higher than expected, moving beyond the deepest layers where they were first released. The darker discovery. The deeper surveys beneath Lake Tahoe did not just reveal barrels and industrial waste. Something else started showing up in the footage, objects that did not belong to construction sites or chemical storage. These were personal, items like luggage, pieces of clothing, and belongings that clearly once belonged to individuals, not businesses. At first, it was confusing. These objects did not follow the same pattern as the dumping sites. They were scattered in ways that did not match industrial disposal, and the condition they were found in made it even more unsettling. The cold water had preserved them far beyond what anyone expected. Fabrics still holding shape. Materials that should have disappeared decades ago are still visible on the lake bed. Then came the part that the research teams were not prepared for. In multiple locations, at depths far beyond what any normal diver could reach, the cameras captured what appeared to be human remains, not just bones. The conditions at the bottom of the lake, near freezing temperatures, almost no oxygen, and no organisms to break things down, had slowed the natural process of decay. What was found had been preserved in a way that felt almost frozen in time. Because of how serious that discovery is, information has been handled very carefully. Official reports have focused on the environmental findings, the barrels, the contamination, and the debris. But when it comes to the deeper footage, the response has been controlled. The footage is under review. Any details connected to possible investigations are being handled quietly. Most of what has been found seems to date back to the 1950s through the 1970s. What the Tourism Board never tell. In the 1950s and 1960s, Lake Tahoe was not just a peaceful vacation spot. It was something closer to a frontier. On the Nevada side, where gambling was legal, casinos grew quickly, money flowed in, businesses expanded, and with that kind of rapid growth came attention from groups that operated outside the law. The Tahoe-Reno corridor became a place where different criminal organizations moved in and out, competing for control. The remoteness of the area made it easier. The same mountains that made the lake beautiful also made it harder to watch. Fewer people, less oversight, more opportunity to operate quietly. For years, stories circulated among locals, stories about people who disappeared, individuals connected to the casino world, rivals, witnesses, or anyone who became a problem. The stories often ended the same way: at the lake, deep enough to hide anything, cold enough to preserve it, dark enough to keep it invisible. These stories were usually treated as legends, something dramatic to talk about but not something proven. They sounded like exaggerations, shaped over time. But the deep water footage suggests something different. Law enforcement agencies have not confirmed the presence of human remains in the footage, but they have not denied it either. The official position remains careful. The material is under review. Any evidence connected to investigations will be handled properly. No details beyond that. What is known is that many missing persons cases from that time remain unsolved. Dozens of individuals connected to the region disappeared between the 1950s and 1970s. Some had links to the casino industry. Some were never found. The conditions at the bottom of the lake explain why. There is one question that sits underneath everything that has been found in Lake Tahoe, and it is not an easy one to answer. All of this dumping, the barrels, the debris, the patterns across the lake floor, does not look like something done by one person acting alone. The scale is too large. Hundreds of containers placed over many years in specific areas that suggest planning. That kind of operation requires coordination, transport, and access. It means more than a few people had to know. Records from that time do not give clear answers. Some documents were never created. Others have been lost, damaged, or quietly removed over time. Many of the companies involved no longer exist in their original form. They merged, changed names, or disappeared completely, making it extremely difficult to trace responsibility after so many decades. But even with missing records, a pattern still begins to appear. Most of the dumping seems to have taken place between the late 1940s and mid-1960s. That timing lines up exactly with the period when the area was growing the fastest. Construction was everywhere. Casinos were expanding. Industries were operating at full speed. The types of chemicals found in the barrels match what those industries would have produced. And the locations where the barrels were found match areas that once had easy road access and very little oversight. Some evidence suggests that officials at the time may not have been completely unaware. Permits were issued that should have raised questions. Inspections that should have happened did not. Complaints were sometimes ignored. It was not always a clear plan or a big secret meeting deciding everything. Instead, it looks like a series of smaller choices. Decisions made by individuals who chose convenience or profit over responsibility. What happens now? Now the situation is different. The footage exists. The samples exist. The data has been collected. And that brings a new question. What should be done about it? The biggest concern is the contamination. The leaking barrels are releasing heavy metals into the water, slowly but steadily. It is not something that causes sudden visible damage, but it is measurable. Over time, it spreads. And this lake is not isolated. It supports wildlife, connects to other water systems, and is used by millions of people every year. Fixing the problem is not simple. The barrels sit at extreme depths where working conditions are dangerous and expensive. Trying to remove them could disturb the area and release even more contamination at once. Some researchers believe it may be safer to leave them in place and monitor how the pollution moves over time. Others argue that leaving toxic waste at the bottom of such an important lake is not acceptable, especially when the public has not been fully informed. At the same time, there is another issue, one that is not just environmental. The possible human remains found at those depths raise difficult questions. Recovering them would require complex operations, and the events connected to them happened decades ago. Many of the people involved are gone. Many cases were never solved. What started as a drought story turned into something far deeper. Beneath the clear surface of Lake Tahoe sits a hidden history, one shaped by choices, silence, and time. The water still looks perfect, but now the truth beneath it can't be unseen. Hit like, subscribe, and stay tuned, because some stories don't end when the camera stops rolling.